Hi, my name is James, and today we're going to be talking about the two most important topics regarding Ford V8 engines and Chevy V8 engines, and we're going to be talking about blocks. So we're going to be talking about Ford and why they didn't really use the terms big block and small block, and why the Chevy small block was so popular. So let's start with Ford first. Now, the most popular vehicle besides the Ford Mustang would be the Ford Thunderbird, and the reason the Thunderbird is so important is from the invention of the Ford Y block, which was the first engine after the famous Ford Flathead, you can really see the evolution of the pushrod engines based on just the Thunderbird and the evolution of Ford V8 engines. Now, Ford uses engine families. So they don't use blocks necessarily, even though you could categorize them as big block or small block. Ford people just don't discuss it in those terms. So they would say, I drive a Cleveland, or I drive a Lima, or I have a modular engine, or I have a 390 FE engine. They have engine families. That's the biggest difference. So like a Windsor small block was the longest running and is still produced today, which is the Windsor, Ontario plant started out with pushrod engines. Then they went to single overhead cam. Now they use the Coyote, which is actually a dual overhead cam. So they're completely different than Chevy is, where they refer specifically to engine families. And while they do use the cubic inch displacement similar to Chevy engines, they follow it with the factory or sort of the family that the engine comes from. So for example, 390 FE Ford Thunderbird would be a common thing, whereas on a Chevy, you'll just hear someone say, I drive a 409, which means they have a 409 cubic inch displacement. And Pontiac doesn't even use block sizing. They switch the internal dimensions. Now, let's talk about Chevy small block. So a lot of people want to know, did the LS engines replace the small block? And the answer is yes or no. They can call this a continuous evolution or a continuation in development. So what they mean is essentially after the iron blocks of the first and the second generation of the small block, the LS series was an aluminum block. So for example, the C5 Corvette, which came around in 1997, was the main advantage was it was a lighter aluminum block. So it shared very few, if no components besides some of the rotating assembly of the previous generation, but it was an aluminum block. So that was the biggest difference when they switched to the LS series. So they are smaller in displacement. They're typically lighter than Ford engines. And so the LS swap is essentially when you take a newer LS engine and put it into an older Chevy product.